Hello, fellow intervention optimization enthusiasts. Welcome to the CADIO webinar. It's really great to have you here, and it's a great pleasure for me to have Michael Lorber with us for the webinar. Michael is a senior research scientist in the Family Translational Research Group here at NYU. He earned his bachelor's in psychology at the University of Washington and his PhD in clinical psychology at SUNY Stony Brook. Michael has been working in the area of families and parenting for a number of years, among other areas. I first met Michael soon after I joined NYU in the fall of 2020. He wasted no time seeking me out. It was a very welcome phone call. At that time, he was considering using the MOST framework in his research. And I soon saw that Michael really gets MOST, and I love meeting people who get MOST. It's wonderful for me because that made him a kindred spirit. In 2021, he was awarded an R01 from NICHD to optimize a free internet-based parenting program. And he's going to tell us about that project today. As you will see, this study is about engagement in an online intervention, and that is a very hot topic. Michael, thanks again for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, so I'll start by giving you the reason why we're doing this research. I think there's a quote from Matt Sanders of Triple P, if you recognize that. If positive parenting is the clean water of children's mental health and well-being, then promoting effective parenting at a whole of population level must become a public policy priority, which I think was a really beautiful phrase. And so why did he say this? I mean, what does he mean by positive parenting, and why did he write this? Well, by positive parenting, it's actually shorthand for a collection of behaviors that I like to summarize as firm but gentle. So not letting your kids get away with murder, enforcing rules, but also being warm and nurturing, and avoiding things like corporal punishment and otherwise angry discipline. So that's the what. And getting on to the why, those forms of parenting are really well established in the research literature. They have tons of associations with all manner of child outcomes, mental health, physical health, cognitive development, you name it. There is a ton of research on that. So in addition to that, there are well-established effects of cognitive behavioral parenting interventions that target those same behaviors. So we got the correlational evidence, and then we have experimental evidence showing that changing parenting, changes child behavior. So what are these? What do these interventions go for? In case you're not familiar with them, like I said, they do go after aspects of positive parenting, such as warmth and affection, and giving reasonable commands to your toddler, having a nice follow through, when to use timeout, avoiding using corporal punishment. Having special play times to build the strength of the relationship and give lots of opportunities for positive reinforcement. They're cognitive behavioral, but really there's a big emphasis on the B in cognitive behavioral. It's the behavioral, because you can't hope to change child behavior if you don't change parents' behavior. That's the whole logic of the intervention. And they're very well established. So a couple that you might be familiar with is Triple P. That's the Matt Sanders from Australia. That's his intervention, which has also got some evidence now in the US. Another really good exemplar is Carolyn Webster Stratton's Incredible Years. They all tap pretty. They all go for pretty similar parenting targets, but in slightly different ways. But there's an awful lot of similarity among these, and not just these. Those are just a couple of examples. A shocking amount of these came out of a pretty small geographic region in Oregon, which explains some of the commonalities among them. But anyway, and so why you would want to give it at a population level. A useful parallel is fluoridation. So as you probably know, a lot of municipalities have water fluoridation as a means of preventing tooth decay. And it's given to the entire population, assuming that they consume the tap water. And it has solid evidence for effects in reducing tooth decay, but the effects are pretty small. So the nature of the effect is that you have lots of small effects on lots of people, and that translates into a population level effect that's worth it in terms of public health dollars and pain and suffering. So back when we were writing this grant, thinking about conducting a study to learn how to get people to engage in these interventions more, or in one specific one, we realized that we couldn't find a single study of an online parenting intervention, which is a natural way to do population level approaches. We couldn't find a single one that was purely automated, didn't involve people at all other than the programmers, was completely free for US parents, and had evidence of effectiveness in a US universal intervention setting, so in unselected people in the population, and also that elicited meaningful engagement. We couldn't find anyone that satisfied all of those criteria, and we think those are important for a few reasons. The fact that the being purely automated helps to minimize barriers, and it makes an intervention more disseminable. People can get to the intervention and use it whenever they want, wherever they are, and almost everyone has the internet in the US. A lot of people have access on their phones only, but that's okay. There's good programming for that too. Also, another thing that reduces barriers and thereby increases disseminability is the fact that it's free. In the setting actually, let me back up. Another important feature would be that the intervention is free for US parents. The parent we're trying to reach is someone who may or may not think that they need a parenting intervention and may have not even considered it before, and having a fee, even a nominal one, is a significant barrier to their participation in many cases. Also, to want to adopt an intervention and one of these online parenting interventions that are designed for populations, you'd want to have evidence that they actually work in the setting to which you're applying it, and that it elicits meaningful engagement. That's where the rubber hits the road. If people do not do the intervention, you won't expect to have much of an effect. And the more you can entice somebody to engage, that's minimizing the barrier of resistance, which is a real thing. So the parent we're trying to reach here, I like to think of them as someone who just put their toddler to bed, and they're sitting on the couch in their sweats or PJs or whatever, and they're surfing the web. Maybe they're going through social media. And I want to get that parent, I want to hook them right then and there and have them start right away, if possible. So having all of those, minimizing all those barriers is really important in being able to elicit meaningful engagement and, have it be something that's worthwhile, that stands a chance of working. So the CDC recognized that state of affairs several years back, and they designed an intervention called "These Essentials for Parenting Toddlers and Preschoolers." And it is just a website. It's a CDC website. It actually kind of feels like a CDC website, which is actually one of the issues that I'll bring up. But it has several components. There are five units of the intervention, and they are very similar to the content of the well-established cognitive behavioral parenting interventions that I mentioned earlier. So there is having special playtime with your child, how to communicate effectively with them, setting routines for the family, which really helps children thrive, as well as units that cover using commands and consequences and timeout and things like that. So really pretty similar, and it has some similar technology in it too. For example, there are actually YouTube videos. That's what's on their website, is links to YouTube videos that they produced that demonstrate the parenting techniques and talk a little bit about them in a fun way. They're actually pretty funny, which again probably helps with engagement. And that's that's on the modeling principle that it's reminiscent of Webster Stratton's incredible years with videotape modeling. Of course, that was started in the 80s, so it was still videotapes, not YouTube, but same idea. It's got articles for people to read and interactive exercises, quick tips, and advice from experts and that kind of thing. And it's been up for a while. I'd say it's probably been up for 7 years at least. But we and Westat were contracted by the CDC to evaluate the intervention early on. And tell you a little bit about that study. This was us and Westat. Actually, it was Westat's contract. We were the subcontractors. And it was a study of 200 US parents of toddlers and preschoolers who were recruited on the internet and were given the same intervention with one difference. In one group that we call natural navigation, we just gave them the website and that's it. We didn't tell them what to do and when to do it. And in the other condition, we used guided navigation, where we use text messaging to remind people to log into parenting units and complete the intervention content, as well as the assessments. Actually, everyone got assessment text messages, but the guided navigation people got reminders to actually do the stuff in the intervention. And what we found is that, well, it's kind of disheartening in a way, but has a glimmer of hope. Typically, people did, really accessed very little of the intervention. So we tracked what percentage of the web resources they actually used, and expressed that as a percentage. And we just call it, we refer to that as self-administered dose. And you can see that there are pretty big humps there between somewhere around 10%. So typically people were not doing a whole lot of it, but there was a lot of variability. And what we found is that we're in the natural navigation condition, people accessed about 16% of the intervention. In the guided navigation condition, it was more than double to about 33%. So really good, preliminary evidence that, using a nudge, which is all these text messages were, small nudges, could help with engagement. Also, parents liked it. They liked the intervention. The mean satisfaction rating was about 4 on a 5-point scale. So what are the takeaways from the pilot? Well, the program is promising, but it's not quite ready for prime time. And parents like it. Parents do more when they're nudged. they engage more, they consume more. But engagement is still a challenge. Even the 33% engagement of the guided navigation group, the group that got the nudges, even, that's not that awesome either. Ideally, you'd want people to engage more to have more of a more pronounced effect. So a question that followed from those observations is, we were thinking about, well, how could we get better engagement with the intervention? So we applied lessons that have been learned from parenting intervention research, in-person parenting interventions, which are the typical way they're done with some sort of therapist or coach. And there's a large literature there because engagement is a real problem. It's probably in all interventions, but parenting interventions can be a tough sell. People want you to fix their kids, and instead you're working with them. That could tick some people off. I can tell you, I've run into that clinically. So it's an issue. But people have done research to find that you can do things to cut down on the resistance and help engagement. And so you can send reminders about sessions and key points from the sessions, key lessons, that kind of thing. You could monitor people's practice of the skills that you're actually trying to teach them. So this is a behavioral intervention, and changing behavior is where the rubber meets the road. So monitoring whether people have actually tried out the techniques is shown to increase engagement. There's a little bit of a motivation there. And some other motivational enhancements, like parents setting their own goals and identifying and planning for barriers so that they feel more personally invested and do more of it as a result. And also, you can reinforce desired behaviors. Therapists can do that in person, but there are other ways to give people incentives, which we'll talk about. Of course, the intervention is actually done in settings, in a setting, without a clinician. So we looked at the literature on behavior change when you don't have people directly involved. There's no clinician, there's no support person or anything like that. And I was really tickled by some behavior economics research that I heard about listening to the Freakonomics radio podcast, where they discussed in detail this series of experiments that they refer to as using nudge interventions. And the Thaler and Sunstein wrote a whole book on this stuff. And they, in the podcast, it really tickled me. And so I went and learned about that. And turned out that things like as simple as text messaging and push notifications to phones and things like that can actually help change behavior. And some evidence of that is what we saw in our pilot investigation as well. Also, there's been a lot of movement on gamification. People trying to, a lot of work has been done in commercial settings where you're trying to get people to stay on your app for as long as possible to, sell them the most advertising or whatever, or pay to get extra features of the game. But that kind of gamification has been applied to behavior change settings as well, health-related behavior change settings. So gamification just means you make the intervention look a little bit more like a game. So you've got some graphics like avatars, digital rewards like points and badges, levels, that kind of thing. And you can also have a little bit of competition. One common feature of gamification is the use of leaderboards. So you can see where you are relative to other quote unquote players. See, and that activates a competitive motivation for doing more of the intervention. Also, everyone, I think, would agree that it's better to get your points across quickly and with less complexity. So simplification is another is another thing that people have, researchers have studied in behavior change experiments, and it's been shown to help with engagement. So that was the background for what we were interested in doing. And we came to a decision point. Should we use an RCT, or should we use this multi-phase optimization strategy? And I can tell you that when we first had these ideas, we didn't know what most was. At least I didn't. Maybe I heard about it at one point, but I really didn't know exactly what it was, and it certainly didn't come to mind. We submitted an RCT comparing a souped-up version of the intervention, that combine all of those things that I just mentioned: simplification, motivational enhancements, gamification, and nudges for when people fell behind. We proposed those to NIH, and comparing that to just the ordinary version of the intervention in a control group, like a classic RCT. The problem, though, with doing that is, and it didn't get funded, maybe it's good that it didn't. The problem with that is, let's say that it had been a real success, and we found that our souped-up version outperformed not only the no treatment control, but the other control group, which is just the intervention without any of the bells and whistles. If we had done that, we wouldn't have known what the active ingredient of the intervention was. It's a multifaceted intervention, and this is a really common problem. People come up with intervention strategies based on lots of good theory and prior observations from empirical work, and they come up with a package of modules or treatment units, and they test that, and then they have no idea which one is, if it works, they have no idea which one is actually doing the main work, what the active ingredient is. And it also creates a parsimony problem. There is a real need to be efficient with intervention. Ideally, you'd want to take up the least amount of time possible from your participants. That is probably something, that if you don't do that, you have more challenges when it comes to getting people engaged. So it just seemed that it was just too early for an RCT. And Anil Chacko, one of the investigators on the project, who's also here at NYU, Anil said, "Hey, Michael, you should check out MOST." I'm like, "What's that?" He said, "Well, Linda Collins has this website, and she's got a couple of free books that she's put up on the internet for people to learn about this approach." So I did, and it seemed to be a really, really good fit to where we were in our research. And the key piece of logic that we locked in on is, before you can evaluate something in an RCT, you first have to optimize it, an intervention, to meet specific criteria. So you should start with optimization prior to evaluating the intervention in an RCT, to avoid that lumping problem and the problem of parsimony that I mentioned earlier. So an optimization trial was a natural match to the stage of development of our research. So in the MOST logic, MOST stands for multi-phase optimization strategy. In that approach, there are different phases, of course, because it's multi-phase. So the first phase is the preparation phase. Well, that work had already been done by the time we showed up. So there was parenting interventions have a long history with lots of effects and lots of different types of populations. And the CDC had already designed a website, and we had already tested a version of it and figured out a way to get engagement at least a little bit better. So the preparation phase work had already been done. we weren't yet ready for the evaluation phase. That was premature, because we didn't think that we were getting a sufficient level of engagement that it would likely produce change in parenting. And change in parenting is the criterion that we care about. That's the, it's the fundamental point of this type of intervention. So if we can't change that, then we're in bad shape, and we need to revisit our models. So where we really needed to be, we thought, was in the second phase of optimization, where we identify which of these elements maximize our key criteria, and which is change in parenting. So what we did is we took this intervention, the Essentials for Parenting, and or what we're doing, we haven't done it yet. We have this this intervention that already exists, the Essentials for Parenting intervention, and we augmented it with experimental factors that represented the engagement-focused elements, 4 of them. So the ones I mentioned earlier. So we simplified the content of the intervention. We cut the number of words almost in half from what the original website was. The original website is quite verbose, so we really cut it down. We also, another factor is motivational enhancements. So we have people develop their own change plan, and we give them normative feedback of how their parenting looks compared to other parents in the population. And we use text messaging to remind people of what their reasons were for participating, what they hope to get out of the intervention, what they plan to do to meet barriers that they encounter. Part of the change plan is, coming up with potential barriers that could get in the way of you enacting your plan. And we did gamification as another factor. And gamification includes the elements that I mentioned of having points and badges and a leaderboard and text messages that keep you focused on the gamification elements. So things that encourage you to get more points or get to the next level, messages of that sort. And then Linda had a really good idea to also have something we call a low engagement nudge. That's the final factor. And if you're falling behind on the schedule that we have, we send you text messages to remind you to log in. And each one of those, no matter which arm of the experiment you're in, you still get the same core intervention, which is the content of the CDC website. And the criteria that we chose was change in parental warmth, a decrease in corporal punishment, a decrease in overreactive discipline, that's like angry discipline, and a decrease in lax or permissive discipline. And what our plan to do is to optimize to all 4 of those simultaneously. And of course, the entire rationale of the experimental factors is trying to find things that increase engagement. So if any one of those facets, for example, gamification makes, produces better change in parenting, we think that the reason that should be is because it impacted engagement. So engagement is the mediator in our conceptual model, and we'll also test that empirically. And by engagement, we mean, content consumption. So how much of the website did they get to? Also, did people really dig in and try stuff and do behavioral skills practice between sessions? between online sessions. And then whether people actually use the skills that were specifically targeted in that module, in each module. So that is the conceptual model of the study. Oh, and one final thing, I'm not really going to focus on this, but we also have a plan to test for some moderators as well. For example, change readiness, but I'm not going to focus on that here because I'm running out of time. So, see, I can't quite see the top of this. I need to move this bar just a moment. So what the design of the study is a factorial optimization trial, and it's a 2K factorial optimization trial in particular. And the 2 stands for how many levels there are of each factor. So we have 4 factors, and each one of them is either present or absent. So you're either getting it yes or not getting it no. And the K is for the number of factors, and we have 4 factors. So we have a 2 to the 4 factorial optimization trial. So we're crossing all 4 of those, all 4 experimental factors. And when you do that, you end up with an experiment that has 16 arms or conditions. And a nifty thing about it is that for each one of the factors, it's a balanced design, with half of the sample getting that experimental factor and half not getting it in every condition. So that helps with power. So you actually have quite a lot of power, even though it's a pretty complicated model by the time you get to 4-way interactions, for example. So we're going to do one of those, and we're sampling 800 parents of 1.5 to 3-year-old children. That's based on power analyses that we did with the MOST R package that was developed by Linda and her collaborators. It's very handy. I highly recommend it. We are going to recruit a national sample online. The entire thing is going to be automated. We're trying to keep this, our study methods, close to how people would actually use this intervention in real life. So the entire thing is automated because that is the setting to which we want to generalize. And we're also stratifying by income relative to family size using the federal poverty ratio, so that we have even representation across different socioeconomic levels, at least in as much as income tells you that. And we get people who are often underrepresented in research into the study. The assessments are all online. They're intensive repeated measures. They're very dense during the intervention period, which is a 10-week period where we've got weekly assessments during that time. And then there's a 6-month follow-up. And the idea there is that we want to have a lot of measurements during the intervention so that we can assess the effects of those manipulations, which we think ought to take place immediately. The follow-up is in there just in case there is something curvilinear, for example, people improving after a while and then stopping with the improvement tapering off. So one bend in the line. So we have a 6-month follow-up for that. We are assessing engagement by behavior directly measured by the intervention platform itself. So we're even measuring how long people look at the videos. And we're using a variety of other measures of the amount of consumption of the website throughout the study. And then we have the self-report measures as well, like whether they did the assigned practice in between. The analytic plan, we're using an intent to treat design and analysis. So intent to treat is analyze as you randomize. So you count in the group to which you were assigned randomly, irrespective of how much of the content you actually consume, if you consume it at all, using robust estimators and latent growth curves. I won't really spend much time on this next slide, but this just gives you, an example of how we're planning to measure each dimension of parenting using growth curves and the intensive repeated measures that we have. And these models can also incorporate curvilinear change. As I mentioned earlier, that's a possibility, and we can test those models as well, but we're primarily interested in linear change. How do these experimental factors, do they produce an increase in parenting across time, in the quality of parenting over time? So the optimization plan is to, we picked our criterion, which is simultaneously optimizing the effects of the intervention on all 4 parenting dependent variables, the ones that I've mentioned before, in which we're going to do by compositing the slope factor scores from the latent growth curve models. So we will be able to simultaneously optimize the intervention for all 4 parenting dependent variables. And of course, we can pick it apart later and see what's changing, behavior by behavior. But we've chosen for our criterion a composite. And we are prioritizing main effects in the optimization plan. There isn't one right way to do optimization research, as Linda goes to pains to explain in her book. But we are prioritizing main effects following a couple of principles of most. One of them is the effect hierarchy principle, which states that main effects tend to be the most important. And as the order of the effect increases, like going from a main effect to a 2-way interaction to a 3-way interaction to a 4-way interaction, probably the likely importance of that effect decreases. Another principle of most that guided our focus on the main effects is the effect heredity principle, which states that an interaction is considered important only if at least one of its factors also has an important main effect. So we're really focused on main effects, although not to the exclusion of interactions, but there is a prioritization of main effects. Basically, the analyses will be done in all in a structural equation modeling environment, so we can use full information, maximum likelihood estimation, and robust estimators, and maintain all of our participants to satisfy the intent to treat principle. And it basically follows a factorial and ANOVA logic, but it's just a regression model. So every main effect and every interaction is in there, as well as potential covariates. There is no right criterion for what counts as important, but the first step of optimization does involve identifying the important main effects and interactions. The criteria that we chose for what counts as important is that they have to meet a p-value criterion and an effect size criterion. So we want coefficients with p-values of less than 0.0333, which is a Bonferroni adjusted alpha, across all those 15 coefficients that will be in the model, and effect size. So we're looking for Cohen's D's that are at or above a small effect size by convention. We think small size effect sizes are reasonable here, given the setting of universal intervention, where we expect small effect sizes for most participants. The second step of optimization is to divide the candidate engagement focused elements, so the simplification, gamification, motivational enhancements, and low engagement nudges, into screened in and screened out sets, but these are just preliminary or provisional. So what our provisional screen-in criteria are, or the main effects are deemed important in step 1. The signs are positive. We don't want to hurt parenting. We're only looking for things that are improving parenting. Of course, we will follow all leads wherever the data lead us. And the other effects that don't meet those screen-in criteria are provisionally put in the screen-out set. Then we evaluate important interactions and consider what they add to the story. 2 particular kinds of interactions that we are keen on are synergistic interactions, where one experimental factor increases the effect of one of the experimental factors is enhanced by another one. So if motivational enhancements only improve parenting in combination with, say, simplification. That would be an example of a synergistic interaction. And then, of course, you can have the opposite, where one factor dampens the effect of one or more of the other factors. So that's what we'll be looking at for the interactions in principle. And then one must finalize decisions for the screened in and screened out sets. And what we're using is an all active components optimization approach, where we revisit each one of the main effects in light of the important interactions that we found in step 2A. So there is a review of the provisional decisions, and we'll do it. It's an iterative process where you start with the factor that has the largest main effect and consider its 2-way interactions with the other factors first, and then look at the 2-way, then look at the 3-way and 4-way interactions, and then repeat that process for each other factor, starting with the second largest main effect and so on. So it's iterative, where you cycle through, beginning with the largest effects or the most important effects. And I'm not going to say much about this. I've got less than a minute, but that's okay. This is a good place to end anyway. Just as a reminder, we will also be testing mediation. So we expect that our engagement-focused elements, if they have an effect on parenting, it's probably because they increase engagement. And we are also testing moderation, because we think that, for example, parents who are more ready for change might, the effects might be larger. And we're exploring some other moderators as well. And of course, we get into moderated mediation territory, a lot of fun, because of our combination of mediation and moderation. So it's possible that a moderator not only affects the effect of the engagement focused factors on engagement, but that it also impacts the associations of engagement with change in parenting. So we'll be able to test those kind of things. And I think I'm going to stop there because I am at 1:45. So I guess we're doing Q&A.
We are. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to do my best to moderate the chat, but feel free to also unmute and ask questions. Just like maybe raise your hand so I can coordinate that. Okay, so scrolling. The first question is probably a little bit more conceptual and how that relates to your experimental design and analytic plan. But the question is about maybe the different groups that these interventions, parenting interventions, your intervention would reach. thinking about different cultural, racial groups and how you might choose to incorporate that within your design, or how you could use your information to inform adaptations moving forward.
Well, we expect to reach a national sample, which we did in the pilot. And I think the methods we're using now will reach an even broader sample. So I expect to have good representation across various racial and ethnic groups. But we also plan to study race and ethnicity as a moderator. I gave examples of moderators here in this diagram, but it's not a full list. So one of the things we will look at is if there are subgroups where the intervention is working differently. So we'll be able to get that information from our study. And I think that given the associations of race and ethnicity and family income, I think our income stratification strategy is going to help produce an adequate range in race and ethnicity so that we can adequately test those questions.
Dr. Barth.
But we don't have any theories about that, though. The intervention was developed and has been tested in all sorts of populations in the past, and it works, for example, in African American and Latino populations, like it does in non-Hispanic white populations. So anyway.
Yeah, Dr. Barth, did that answer your question? You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I was curious about whether you did have prior research to indicate that it was broadly successful, that these pieces were broadly successful in different populations, but it sounds like you have enough confidence about that to allow those just to be moderators and not have that drive your design.
Right, but they might drive the design of the next study, pending the results of this one. But no, we haven't really studied these experimental factors, and I don't think anyone else has yet either. This combination of factors, so we don't have, an empirical track record there. The only relevant empirical track record is from prior research with parenting interventions. And there it's had a good track record in various groups.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Great that we're on the conceptual model. Dr. Wasser asks if you could describe the proximal mediators for the components. Heather, feel free to jump in if you want more.
Yeah, just looking at the model, it looked like they're all targeting engagement, and based on your talks, I just wanted to know a little bit more about those proximal mediators.
Sure. Well, I think it is all engagement. Each one of them is designed to get people to consume more, and do more of the intervention activities. I suppose you could argue that, anytime you look at a quote unquote proximal mediator, there probably isn't even more proximal mediator. It's like an endless regress problem, right? There's always something that preceded it. So there are certainly unmeasured proximal mediators of the effects of things like these experimental conditions on engagement. I'll bet you, I would bet anything that that's true. I mean, I guess it has to be. But each one of the entire rationale of the experimental factors is to boost engagement as a mechanism of improving those dimensions of parenting that are up there.
So I think we are very fortunate to have some of our more recent attendees from one of our trainings, and we give the strong recommendation that there's a component targeting one mediator, and then we can have other things in our conceptual model. So I would almost argue that simplification is both the component as well as like the proximal mediator. And I'm just trying to make that connection because I'm looking particularly at Anne Marie and being like, still do the conceptual model like we told you. So that just wanted to make that connection.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, actually. I was considering putting one of those in the grant, and ultimately I just thought it would end up taking too much explaining, and that it was simpler to do this, and simpler for the presentation here. But yes, that's true.
But the purpose of simplification is to make the it's to make the intervention easier to understand, right? And so
to take less time, really. It was already at a good, like, 6th grade reading level. So
yeah, I know. Yeah, for brevity, especially in proposals, we often hide sort of all of the details on the mediator. So I just was curious, since I had you here, to see if you had specific thoughts of how you were breaking that engagement down. So that was sort of the motivation for my question. But thank you, very helpful.
Yeah, Anne Marie, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Michael, excellent, by the way. I'm looking at the nudge theory for an automated physical activity intervention. So this was really helpful on so many levels. But I guess I had a question, and I'm sorry that I don't have the language. So Kate and Linda, I'll defer to you. But as I look at the low engagement nudges, because an RCT was done in the adult population, I'm modifying for the young adult. But we noticed from the RCT that there was low engagement at a certain time point, and so then it kind of became, it's something that we're thinking about adding in my proposal. But Kate and Linda, help me, because that changes, because that's not going to be the same for that's not going to be a candidate component for everyone, right? So at a certain point, if there's certain people that are low engagers, then that's going to kick in. And what's the language for that type of design? It's not like there's not like, the 4 components. The low engagement nudges will only come for people who are not engaged. Does that sound correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds correct. But Michael, I think you're probably thinking that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that practically everyone is going to get at least one of those, right?
Okay.
Yeah, that's true. If you look at the experimental design, there's only one arm, 50 people out of 800 who are not going to get any of these enhancements.
Well, no, what I meant is that practically everyone will need a nudge at some point.
Right? Yeah. I'll bet, based on the pilot, I'm sure that a lot of people are going to get nudged for that.
Okay. I'm just trying to think about when I write up the design, because I don't want to say it's a constant component, because it's not, but it's not like its own candidate component per se. It's only going to go to some people. Yeah,
I think I know what you mean, Anne Marie, because that is, yes, so that is actually an adaptive strategy.
Yes, that's the word. Thank you.
And so when you have a component that represents an adaptive strategy, there's different ways to examine it. And if you're not interested in optimizing the adaptive strategy itself, if the question is, okay, this is what I'm going to do, now do I include this as a component in the intervention or not, then you would take the approach that Michael used and use a traditional, more traditional factorial experiment. If you're interested in something like, well, what should be the trigger for someone to get one of these nudges, for example, then you would probably be looking at a SMART or an MRT.
Okay, and my last question on that same, if we do an adaptation, the sample size needs to be higher to accommodate such, correct?
I can't answer that question, Anne-Marie, without knowing more about exactly what the research questions are. And
perfect.
You just can't talk about design without having more details. But having said that, I'm happy to talk with you about it anytime.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think a lesson that I learned, and Linda, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that this type of factorial design is actually, it's relatively cheap in terms of the number of participants to add additional factors.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think I probably tried to convince you to use more than 4 factors in the experiment. I usually try to get people up to 5 factors. But yeah, you can most of the time, not always, but most of the time you can add another factor to a factorial experiment, or sometimes more than one, without having to increase the number of experimental participants. Of course, that increases the number of experimental conditions to be managed. So I sometimes say that you can add 1 or more factors for free. That's a little disingenuous, because actually it's not free, because you have more to manage. The experiment becomes more complex. But in most of in the kind of work we do in intervention science, participants are usually the biggest expense. Recruiting participants and engaging them in the study and keeping them from dropping out. That's usually the biggest expense. And so it is kind of nice to think you could add a couple more factors, but without having to incur those kinds of additional expenses.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
I have a question for Michael. I was surprised to see you using a Bonferroni. Can you just explain what the rationale is for that?
Yeah, sure. It's twofold. I don't know what percentage goes to each one of the folds, but the first one is wanting to not wanting to get any false leads, so just typical type 1 error control, just making sure that the things that we see are likely really there and probably reproducible. That's one piece of rationale, because I think there's a subtext of Linda's question, which is you don't have to use that. In fact, quite often it isn't used. The other factor was we thought it would be more fundable if we did that.
Yeah, but I guess now the question is that actually what you're going to do?
Yeah, I guess I would call these optimization criteria soft. This is my first optimization trial. Luckily, we have Linda and Kate on, who have a lot of experience with it, who will help us, figure out the best optimization strategy.
Well, I'm gonna try and convince you not to use the Bonferroni when the time. So at least I'll make a pitch for it. I mean, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if you do, but anyway, that would actually be an interesting conversation for another time.
I think we're well powered enough to tolerate it. I think so. Maybe.
Are you getting? Is your target sample size 800 subjects?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're getting into the fun, nerdy stats content. But just in the interest of time, wanted to mention 2 things. I put in the chat a link to Dr. Jillian Strayhorn's paper about factorial mediation, if you were interested in that. And then also a last call plea. We have our applications for our May training in MOST are due on Friday. The application's real brief. Please feel free to share that with your team's networks, colleagues. And that's it.
I think
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. This was great. Thank you very, very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.